Well, thank you all for coming here. This is the last lecture in the signature lecture series for this season, for this semester. And it's going to be a rare treat indeed. We are the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. I'm Steve Balch, and of course we're interested in a great many things, as anyone who has been attending to the season of lectures that we have put on. But we are very much interested in freedom and the survival of a free society, and America is certainly one of the great models, if not the greatest model, of a free society in world history. And it came to be, in some measure, unlike most other countries, its institutions came to be through a kind of design. People actually sitting down and thinking through how they wanted the country to be governed and what its basic foundational political principles should be. So today we are really delighted to have one of the leading experts on the American founding and on our constitutional history, Professor James Caesar of the University of Virginia. He holds the, if you remember this gentleman, Harry F. Byrd Chair in politics at the university, and is the author of a dozen books, and they really range the gamut. Every 4 years, he produces a book on the last presidential election. His dissertation, which turned into a book, was called Presidential Selection, so he's sort of been on that route ever since. But he also writes a good deal about the founding and about founding principles. A book called Reconstructing America is an interesting effort to assess European reactions to the American founding and to this new state of affairs on earth that we were bequeathed by the years 1776 and 1787. Today he is going to be talking about the founder's founder, James Madison, man often referred to as the father of the Constitution, and not only his role in the founding, but his role in developing the very concept in America that we all swear by today, of a founding, of America being a country that was founded. So, without further ado, let me turn the podium over to Jim. Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you, Steve, for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to speak, I don't think for very long, but I'll talk some about the American founding, and maybe we'll have a chance at the end for some discussion. Americans regularly speak today of our founding and our founders. Our founders are everywhere. They are honored on the monuments, large and small, and commemorated by the names of countless schools and streets, none more iconic than Madison Avenue. This focus on founding is rare in the world today. There was, of course, the founder of the Communist Soviet Union, Lenin, of Fascist Italy, Mussolini, and of National Socialist Germany, Hitler. But these regimes are no more. Ataturk, hailed once as the great founder of modern Turkey, has largely been erased by Erdogan, and Mao Zedong just barely hangs on inside of China. In the democracies in the West and throughout the world, we have people like Gandhi in India who are remembered, Mandela in South Africa, perhaps Havel in the Czech Republic, and de Gaulle in France. But the other European nations, like Britain or the Netherlands, have grown into their current condition without ever having a founder. With its attention to being founded, America today is more the exception than the rule. Unlike most other states, America has made founding a central theme of its political science. But Americans are remarkably imprecise when it comes to assigning the label of a founder. To whom should it apply? For most, a founder refers to an important political figure who helped the nation get started. At an Independence Day celebration on July 4th today, between enjoying grilled hot dogs and viewing fireworks, Thomas Jefferson is almost sure to be mentioned. But no one would take exception if George Washington, James Madison, or Alexander Hamilton were also added to the list. These men, and others too, are variously considered our founders, having played a role to establish a new political order. Let's try, however, for a little bit more precision than the average American has in mind. Founding can refer to three key moments in the establishment of the nation: the Revolution, the writing and ratification of the Constitution, and the launching of the government and passage of the Bill of Rights. The founding period thus runs from the Battle of Lexington in 1775 through the end of Washington's first term in 1793. Those who merit the designation of founders include our revolutionary leaders, like Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, and Washington, the principal figures who prepared and defended the Constitution, Madison, Washington, Hamilton, and then the political actors who helped shape the new federal government in its critical first few years, Washington, Hamilton, and Madison. I suppose if someone demanded to know which of these three moments should be designated the founding, most historians would probably give the award to the constitutional period of 1787-1788. At the center of this event was James Madison, the person subsequently labeled the father of the Constitution. Madison was essential in promoting the formation of a new government and in defining the terms of debate at the Philadelphia Convention. Along with Hamilton, he was the main author of the Federalist, which explained and defended the Constitution during the ratification contest. Feeling duty-bound by an implicit agreement reached in many states during the ratification debate, Madison also was the chief force in Congress in 1790 and 91 in pushing for the Bill of Rights. James Madison is the subject of my talk this evening, but less for serving as a principal founder himself than for introducing the conception of founding, or law-giving as it was sometimes called, into American thought. Before there could be a founding, there had to be an idea of founding. The idea had to become part of our way of thinking. Madison provided this intellectual breakthrough. He is the founder in America of the idea of founding. This fact goes wholly unrecognized today, as no one thinks that the idea of founding ever needs to be reestablished. Founding is taken for granted and regarded as perfectly natural. We speak of the founding and the founders for the reason we believe that we had a founding and founders. But was the connection between preparing a written constitution and founding regularly made in 1787? Did Americans associate what was being done at that time with the great instances of founding or lawmaking that had been accomplished in antiquity under Moses, say, in the desert of Sinai, like Lycurgus in ancient Sparta, or Solon in Athens? Does the language of founding and lawmaking fit so readily with these classical examples? The truth, I believe, is that this terminology of founding was rarely employed in America before 1788. Almost no one, for example, used the language of founders to designate those who wrote America's first national constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Was John Dickinson, the primary author of the Articles, ever honored as a founder? Not that I know of. John Adams perhaps saw himself as a founder when he wrote the Constitution of Massachusetts in 1780, but no one else, with the possible exception of Abigail, saw him in this way. The idea of founding, far from being self-evident to all, had to be revived and promoted in 1787 and 1788. It had to be brought back into our scope of thinking. Reintroducing this language belongs to the authors of the Federalist, and above all to James Madison. It was Madison who took up the theme of the lawgiver and began comparing America's constitutional writers to the seminal lawgivers of antiquity. Madison's purpose was to have Americans view the events unfolding before them through the lens of the idea of lawmaking, with all its connotations of extraordinary action and bold remaking. Madison refined the idea of founding and suggested, really quite audaciously, that America's founding rivaled and perhaps would even replace the models of foundings of the ancient world. Without this step, those whom we call our founders today might not be known as founders at all. I want to talk a little bit at the outset about the concept of founding. founding or lawmaking was once one of the fundamental themes of classical political science. Lawmaking was understood as the effort of an individual to bring into being good government, or at any rate the best government possible under an existing set of circumstances. Two elements might be involved in the act of founding. First, there was the acquisition of knowledge of what promoted good government. In the case of the founding of Sparta, as described by the Roman historian Plutarch, the greatest founder of antiquity, a person by the name of Lycurgus, made an extensive voyage around the Aegean Sea. Before undertaking his task at home in Sparta, he studied different forms of government on the islands there and considered which might best suit his native land. In Crete, Lycurgus consulted the philosopher Thales, who had begun to elaborate a science of politics that studied the best regime and good regimes and how they could be established. The persons who developed this knowledge of regimes, I suppose Aristotle was the most illustrious example of all in ancient time, they may be thought of as the teachers of lawgivers. He is, if you will, this one, the teacher, a kind of proto or invisible founder, standing behind the actual founder and supplying advice. Now, the second dimension of founding is the action of actually executing the task, which is the job of the founder, properly speaking. Perhaps this person had availed himself of a body of knowledge, as Lycurgus did with Thales, or perhaps a founder founded without such knowledge, just proceeding on his own and doing the best he could. In any case, founding is only partly capable of being mapped out in advance by theoretical knowledge. Given the importance of particular circumstances in actual situations, the facts on the ground in each place will dictate different strategies. Knowledge only serves as a partial guide for action. Gauging the situation they face, some lawgivers decided to settle for much less than they might have wished for. According to Madison in The Federalist, the Athenian founder Solon confessed that he had, I quote, not given his country the government best suited to their happiness, but most tolerable to their prejudices. On the other hand, Madison remarks, Lycurgus remained more true to his object. This led him to take chances and to use violence and authority and superstition to accomplish his objectives. Lycurgus founded Sparta by resorting to extraordinary measures. These measures of force were at odds with the principle on which the Spartan political system was eventually to work. If you look at matters closely, Sparta was founded with violence, but was set up to operate without violence. Thus, there was a potential tension between the act of founding and the moment of founding and the political system that was subsequently established. Let's take a look now at some of the famous theorists in the West later on who dealt with the idea of founding. Niccolo Machiavelli is one of the most famous of these cases. He reformulated the classical account of founding and gave the subject his own special points of emphasis. Machiavelli brought the motives of the founders into the equation, asking how the task of founding might fulfill the founders' own interests, something the ancients didn't consider fully. No longer did Machiavelli assume that founders acted automatically to do the good for their compatriots without achieving something for themselves. Founders had to get something from this. They had to acquire maybe their own glory and their own renown. The founders' goals had to be squared with promoting the public good. In line with the ancients, Machiavelli also set out two general dimensions of founding. First, founding was aided by theoretical knowledge that he called, Machiavelli, the rules for the government of princes. Machiavelli offered his own political science as the best source of instruction, insisting that it was superior to the classics' understanding because his was more realistic. It took its bearings from how one actually lives rather than how one should live. The one who possesses this knowledge, though he does not literally act, the teacher, is the proto or invisible founder, and Machiavelli himself was such a person. Second, Machiavelli turns to the actual founder, the actor who engages in the actual activity of founding. In his book, The Prince, Machiavelli depicts this person as one who makes his way by use of his own arms and ability. The greatest of founders, Machiavelli said, were Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and the like. These figures, Machiavelli said, took the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. In his Discourses on Livy, another book he wrote, Machiavelli discusses these leaders under the name of founders, foundatori, and specifies their attributes and political behavior. A defining feature of a founder, according to Machiavelli, is that he almost always acts by himself. Founding is an activity of an individual person, not the work of a committee. This fact allows Machiavelli to excuse the actions of Romulus, who famously murdered his brother Remus. Romulus was the founder of Rome. We must assume, Machiavelli wrote, that it never or rarely happens that a republic or monarchy is well constituted, or its old institutions entirely reformed, unless it is done by one individual. It is even necessary that he whose mind has conceived such a constitution should be alone in carrying the project into effect. Founding is an act of enormous difficulty. I'll wait till you can get seated. It's good. Hi. Founding is an act of enormous difficulty, requiring an extraordinary degree of authority. Yet a founder often begins without holding an office of any kind. His authority eventually derives from taking advantage of what Machiavelli calls an opportunity, meaning a situation in which a people is faced with dire circumstances. These circumstances either already exist or the founder helps to create them. An opportunity is sometimes known today as a crisis, which, as we know, is a terrible thing to waste. Opportunities create a situation in which people are disposed to follow. This spontaneous inclination only lasts so long, however, until things get difficult. People then grow discontented and wish to be rid of the founder, as when Moses faced rebellions in the desert from those who had willingly followed him out of Egypt. At some point, Machiavelli observes, a founder will need to assure his authority by compelling obedience. As Machiavelli says, things must be ordered in such a mode that when the people no longer believe, one can make them believe by force. Force consists of the use of physical arms or psychological control, most often by manipulating religious beliefs to instill fear. Founding for Machiavelli took place on different levels. It can refer to changing the frame of government inside of an existing state, or it can mean establishing an altogether new nation or political form, perhaps one that never existed before. Or, this is a little different, it can mean transforming an entire culture or civilization from, say, the pagan era transformed into the Christian era, and then the Christian era transformed partly into our modern Enlightenment age. Founding in this last case extends beyond politics in the usual sense of acting as one would holding political power over others. Instead, the founding of cultures is a project that no single person can ever accomplish in a lifetime. Only a founder endowed with a religious message or an active set of theoretical ideas can hope to succeed in such an enterprise. The thinker-actor induces others to carry out parts of the project, often without realizing that they're doing so. A type of invisible founder becomes, as it were, a real founder, exercising influence across centuries and bringing into being new modes and orders. The greatest examples would be Jesus, or perhaps Paul, who launched Christianity to change the pagan mode of thinking and make it a Christian one. And then maybe Machiavelli himself, who was instrumental in founding the Enlightenment project, which has slowly been eroding Christianity. René Descartes, the thinker who inaugurated the Enlightenment project within the realm of philosophy, also offered an account of the lawgiver that extended Machiavelli's analysis. Early in his book, The Discourse on Method, Descartes describes his ideal city planner, who is a stand-in for the founder. Descartes wrote, here's a little bit of a long quote, but I think it can be followed. There's not so much perfection in works created by the hands of various masters as there is in those which one person has worked on alone. Thus we see that the building which a single architect has undertaken and completed are usually more beautiful and better ordered than those which several people have tried to refurbish by making use of old walls built for other purposes. Descartes then goes on to propose building a new kind of city in regular places which an engineer has designed freely on the level ground. So Descartes' lawmaker is again a single person who tears everything down and begins everything de novo, relying on a science like engineering, which supplies exact answers. The founder acts unconstrained by custom or by ancient structures. The founder eliminates the past and custom and builds the new city from scratch. Descartes presents the technocrat's dream, a founding operated with complete rational control, unimpeded by the wishes of the many. A final example of a post-classical a student of founding is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who envisaged the lawmaker in the most extraordinary of terms. Rousseau depicts the founder once again as acting on his own, seeing further than all other people. Founders are responsible for establishing an entirely new system, far surpassing the accomplishments of statesmen who only put into effect what founders had created. The founder should never try to govern. He merely sets up the new system. Merely, I said, that's the most important thing, and then disappears. Few possess the genius, Rousseau wrote, to perform this function, which demands the ability, and here's a quote from Rousseau, to change human nature, so to speak, to transform each individual, who on his own is a complete and solitary whole, into a part of a greater whole, from which he, in a way, receives his life and his being. The founder's task exceeds in difficulty what any other political actor is asked to do. Executing a plan of founding must be fitted carefully, according to Rousseau, to the needs of each place, which vary greatly. A general science of politics, therefore, can only take one so far. Artistic or poetic insight is also required. The act of founding must generate an extraordinary authority that goes beyond what reasoned arguments could ever persuade a people to do. A founder must always have to invoke divine sanction to accomplish this project. So this is the account then of the founders. Now I want to turn to the thought of the British in the 17th and 18th centuries and their attempt to deny founding. The British are extremely important because we took a great deal of our political thought from the British. So British political thought in the 17th and 18th centuries appeared in the form of two schools of thought known as contract theory, associated with John Locke, and organic development. Those were the two most important schools of thought, and they both eliminated the founder. These schools may have done so with a deliberate strategy in mind of discouraging would-be Machiavellian leaders from unsettling the political world. Or they may have concluded that founding was an artifice or a fiction, especially for modern times. Whichever the case, these schools broke from classical and early modern thought and presented their political science without the presence of the figure of the lawgiver. Americans, as we'll see in a minute, relied greatly on British political thinking in the late 18th century. But with Madison and the Federalists, we see that they brought founding back into political science. So first, contract theory, which derived largely from John Locke. It held that governments formed by individuals voluntarily coming together on the basis of reasoned calculations of how best to secure their primary rights. Above all, a right to life or personal safety, and a right to the preservation of one's property. The creation of a sound political order is assisted, they said, by a science of politics, made popular, that helps in the actualization of forming a society. So this is basically the state of nature that so many speak of. This science explains how people living in a state of nature, which is a situation without government, would logically transition from that state into civil government. This model can eventually be adopted everywhere. Setting up a civil society has no need of a great founder endowed with extraordinary authority. The origination of society is routinized and accomplished in a reasonable and semi-automatic process of creating a social contract. Contract theory is a replacement for the idea of founding. Resting on the logic of reason and interest, it eliminates all reliance on chance. Waiting for a great heroic leader to appear, which cannot be guaranteed, is now unnecessary. No longer is there a need for a singular person of extraordinary political genius to act. If certain minimal conditions are found, like the elimination of religious superstition, the establishment of a sound civil society should follow. So that's one version of a political science without a founder. Now, organic theory, or Whig jurisprudential theory, was the other major school of thought in political science in Britain. It taught that the English Constitution had formed gradually over time as a product of accident and piecemeal adjustment, not rationally founded at the beginning. So a series of accidents that created that Constitution. England, by this account, never had a single moment when it began. It had no founding or founders. Its origins lay somewhere way back when, whether in the forests of Germany, among the Gothic tribes, or at some other time immemorial, prior to the advent of clear records. England's magnificent constitution then grew by trial and error. Human intelligence appeared along the way to produce what the philosopher and statesman Edmund Burke called reform. It introduced adjustments and partial corrections using human intelligence. But there was no such thing as a wholesale transformation as Descartes described. Organic theory, and the word organic is, I think, indicative that things grow slowly. You never quite know which way they grow. But organic theory argued further that a science of politics is unequal to the task of founding. The process is just too complex. It's beyond what any human being, regardless of intelligence, can manage. In addition, the extraordinary authority needed to carry out the task of founding is a threat to liberty. Founding destroys restraint and collectivizes all power in the hands of the founder. He controls society at the moment things are founded. It must be achieved, or it may be achieved by force or by fraud. This example of this kind of beginning will then live on and sanction later attempts to destroy free government. So founding, in a way, is the enemy of freedom. Proponents of organic theory presented their account of English constitutional development as actual history. This assertion may reflect their best understanding of history, but it may also represent a constructed narrative designed to conceal elements of the past and may make people forget the radicalness of attempts to make changes by founding. The organic school seems to have been less concerned with perfect accuracy than with presenting, in the guise of history, the teachings of its political philosophy. Organic theory was meant to dampen the enthusiasm Machiavelli had created to make ambitious men think of clean slates and new beginnings, things which fired the imagination of would-be founders. Moderation for this school was the watchword. To this end, organic theory eliminated founding. Burke explained that the British Constitution had not been formed, I quote, upon a regular plan or with any unity of design. Instead, it grew in the length of time and by a great variety of accidents. As if in opposition to Descartes, Burke was partial to the crooked and narrow streets of the old city, preferring them to new engineered plans. Burke abhorred founding. He expressed himself with a notable directness, quoting him, "The very idea of the fabrication of a new government is enough to fill us with disgust and horror." Well, that's the background to the American founding. I'll say a few words about America's founding. American political thought in the 18th century broke with both schools of British thought and brought the theme of founding back into political science. So in this respect, to return to the classics. For all that, Americans had borrowed from the English, and they were indebted to the English greatly. This difference between America and Britain divided and still divides the two countries. It separates their traditions of conservatism, with Americans largely celebrating a deliberate beginning and a founding, and the British anchoring their constitutional system in custom and evolution. Americans accept the concept of founding, even celebrate it. The British do not. The Federalist, America's most important work of political thought, disputes the claim of organic theory that political institutions are the result of unplanned growth and accident. Its opening paragraph in the Federalist Papers announces plainly that the outcome to the debate over ratification, which was going on, will determine, and here I take a quote from Federalist 1, it will determine whether societies of men are capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. So that's a kind of reply to the organic theory, who believed that things came about by accident. The Federalists obviously favored reflection and choice, positing that intentional founding is possible. America's founders were certainly not wide-eyed idealists, eager to reject what was old and customary just because it was old and customary. Yet they made clear that, when necessary, they would follow a wholly new course. The Constitution would mark an historical point in world history. Madison reminded his readers what the revolutionary leaders had set in motion. He writes, "Happily for America, happily we trust for the whole human race. They pursued a new and more noble course. They accomplished a revolution which has no parallel in the annals of human history. They reared the fabrics of government which have no model on the face of the globe." The Federalist divergence now from the other school of British thought I mentioned, contract theory, is maybe a bit more complicated. American thinkers at the time regularly turned to John Locke to discuss the origin of government, and they often fit the revolution into the framework of his theory of the social contract. Yet, the establishment of a new government for them went beyond anything that Locke had emphasized. Without the deliberate exertions of a small number of men, that is, without founders, a new constitution in America would never have been proposed. The plan for a new government was not the result of spontaneous thought of the mass of citizens. It came from the efforts of a few lawmakers. The Federalists' embrace of the concept of founding returned the idea, therefore, of greatness to American political life. It restored a claim of rank and hierarchy between founders and people. There were now great men performing great deeds at a critical moment. Everything hinged on their deliberate action. The Federalist also defends the personal attributes of the founders in the Federalist Papers. A founder is one who combines knowledge of the science of politics, judgment in determining where theoretical knowledge applies to existing circumstances, and persistence and boldness in pursuing the nation's interests. The authors of the Federalists were subtly presenting a picture of themselves. The theme of founding culminates in James Madison's explicit introduction of the lawmaker in Federalist number 38. Madison, in this essay, introduces the theme of founding. He provides a list of 14 ancient reformers or lawgivers, examining cases in which government had been established with deliberation and consent. It goes back to the classics. This list includes Theseus, Lycurgus, Solon, and Romulus. Madison then proceeds to compare America's founding with these renowned figures of antiquity. He casts a glance at the future, too. If the Constitution were ratified, Americans' founders would become not just worthy rivals of the ancients, but, in light of what Madison thought were the improvements made by Americans on the ancient mode of preparing constitutions, their superiors. The argument for the preeminence of America's founders is seen from how the task of founding was carried out. Beginning, let's say, with the number of founders. Madison recalled that the ancients had spoken of the task of founding as always being performed by some one individual of preeminent wisdom, never by an assembly of men. However, in opting for a select body of persons at the convention and afterwards, Americans entrusted the task of founding to a few persons. Madison conceded that this method of relying on several people risks creating discord and disunion, and one can think of all the problems that emerged at the convention, the compromises that had to be made. But it also offered the prospect of achieving more thorough wisdom through dialogue and greater consensus in favor of the outcome. When it came to the question of how a plan of governing was to be adopted, ancient practice ranged from founders who tried to discern what the people would agree to and follow that, which limited what could be proposed, or else they abandoned consent altogether and relied on compulsion, seeking greater perfection. Madison admitted to having some admiration for the founders who used force, but this approach was clearly impossible in America. The founders in 1787 lacked the means to compel. There was no national army under their control. All that was left to them was persuasion. Nor did the American founders appeal to unnatural or supernatural forces working in their favor, unless one counts the providential fact of having George Washington on their side. Seeking consent in the ratification process brought an additional benefit. No gap or tension existed between the act of founding in America and the subsequent system of rule which the Constitution created. Both were based on Republican principles. Ratification became a legal means to create a social compact, setting a precedent for other modern republics. Note how this process contrasts with the methods followed within the European Union, where referenda by the publics of some member states have been ignored as revisions of the European Union have continued. Madison's examination of ancient examples of founding confirmed what he learned himself at the convention. Founding, even under the most favorable circumstances, revealed, as he said, the hazards and difficulties incident to such experiments, and the great imprudence of unnecessarily multiplying them. This conclusion prepared Madison to take a new and decisive step, acting alone, by the way, in the fashion of an ancient founder. In the process of writing the Federalist, he set forth a new meaning to what exactly we should mean by a written constitution and what it should be. To avoid repeating the great difficulties of founding, which present these hazards, Madison proposed that the Constitution should be regarded with veneration and with reverence, and not easily or frequently changed or altered. With deepening support over time that comes with age, the Constitution would then have the prejudices of the community on its side. The instrument of a written Constitution, superior to statutory law and changeable only by a process separate from ordinary lawmaking, was an American innovation that developed in the States in the period after the Revolution, beginning right at the end of the Revolution itself. Yet this fact never extended to the idea that a constitution should be thought of as an enduring symbol that would connect future generations to a founding period. Even today, a written constitution is not automatically associated with something that should be treated with great respect or reverence. In many of the states, for example, people have no such feelings, nor are they expected to. Constitutions in many states are easily amended, and many of them have been rewritten in full. It would take a person of peculiar temperament and perhaps questionable sanity to venerate the Constitution of California. Madison's idea of forging a connection between veneration and the Constitution deepened in early 1788. It emerged in response to the planned publication and circulation of Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, a book which proposed a very low threshold for revising written constitutions. It contained, in fact, a different idea of what a written constitution was. Jefferson regarded written constitutions more as ordinary law, supreme in their legal status, yes, but ordinary in the sense that, like statutory law, they should be regularly updated and improved. Jefferson, in fact, proposed later the idea that every generation should rewrite the Constitution. A reverence for the Constitution and for its founders, Jefferson believes, imprisons the public mind. It favors a disposition to accept past authority, to reject past authority, and it fosters superstition. Jefferson mocked this kind of subservience. He later wrote something which is quite famous. Some men, he said, look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence, and they deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human, and suppose what they did to be beyond all amendment. Like many progressives at the turn of the 20th century, who picked up on Jefferson's sentiments and borrowed his language, placing founders on a pedestal and venerating their documents should be rejected at all costs. the persons living today will possess greater political wisdom than those who lived in the past. And those who live in the future will have greater wisdom than those living now. For Jefferson, laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. If there was a prevailing understanding of what a written constitution was in 1787, before Madison wrote his essays, I believe Jefferson's may well have been the one. Madison offered something entirely new and different. Though he was no blind worshiper of ancestors, he saw no reason to defy prudence and to invite constant constitutional revisions. Better, he thought, to respect the achievement that was made in 1787, shield it from undue pressure of change, and protect it from future actions of those likely to possess far less political intelligence and prudence than those in Philadelphia. Even more importantly, reverence for the Constitution affects how people think of the entire political world about them. It creates, to use a fancy term, a certain political epistemology. It encourages citizens to look to and value the past, a past that in this instance provided near as much as one could hope for. Without this disposition to venerate the past, it's hard to imagine that we could have had founders at all. Thank you.
Questions? So you're talking about how James Madison and how he wanted to create this veneration for the Constitution. Do you think he did that because he saw the initial founding as potentially unstable and he wanted to kind of solidify in the ideas of the people that they are now a nation and that it should continue in this kind of way, and it shouldn't there shouldn't be another upheaval fairly recent down the road?
Yeah, I think he wanted to make sure that it would be permanent and to solidify it. And recall, how can you be a founder truly if the Constitution is going to be changed every generation? You'd forget about them. These were 30 guys or so that got together and wrote something, and 18 years later we wrote something else. So founding goes along with this idea of veneration of the Constitution, which stabilizes. Now, of course, Madison did allow for amendments, and there was room for change. But essentially wanted the Constitution, the bulk of the Constitution, to remain intact, which in some ways it has. So that's why one of the reasons we look back to the founders and we take it as so natural when it's not natural in other places. Yes, sir.
Yeah. How do you think the founders would view our current Constitution with lasting over 200 years and just 20-something amendments?
That would have been in the spirit of Madison. That's what it would be like. Unlike state constitutions, which have been, many of them, depends on the state, but many have been rewritten from top to bottom, or amendments are added usually, and you never know who the founders are, or almost never. So the federal constitution is based on another theory of what a written constitution is. So the Constitution remains in effect with few changes that on the surface describes our political system. Now, in reality, it's not so simple. The Constitution's changed a lot by actions of people, which aren't always respected, or it's changed by Supreme Court decisions, which change it enormously. But still, it's possible in all circumstances for people to say, the founders would not have liked that. The founders would not have accepted this, or this is unconstitutional. That has a lot of impact, at least in the start of an argument. And the basic structure of the Constitution, leave the rights aside, those were added later, but a little bit later. But the Constitution still exists with, at least at the national level, with the importance of separation of powers. A fact which I think Democrats who recently were unfavorable to the idea of separation of powers have now warmed up to a bit since 2016. Yes?
You have given me a whole different framework in which to think about the two different schools of thought within the Supreme Court. Constitution is a living, breathing document, and we must be changing it to modern times. And no, the Constitution is solid, and we need to uphold it as it stands. And you have provided a whole different framework for looking at that whole argument. I really appreciated it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think this view is a little bit more on the side of originalism. You could make an argument that from this that it would be possible by a lot of work to try and say that even with this argument, the Constitution should be interpreted in light of what happened yesterday or early this morning and changed like that. But I think that does grasp probably what Madison had in mind. That's been debated, though, exactly what he thought the judiciary would be. And of course, the judiciary has assumed a degree of importance, which probably was never intended in quite that way in 1787. Yes. Oh, yes.
Pearson has a question.
I have two questions. One, you did not mention Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan, which directly, from everything I read, led to John Locke. And then there was the Dutch Republic, which had established a written constitution some years earlier, but Madison and his other writers of the Federalists never mentioned the Dutch Republic, but I would think that they had some awareness of the Dutch Republic having a written constitution.
Yeah, not so sure about that. Jefferson wrote, this question of who wrote the first real constitution, a written constitution, which guided the framework of government. When did that actually begin? Jefferson said it began in the United States with the Virginia Constitution. He was wrong about that. It was probably South Carolina. But one can find examples in the past. I'm not sure whether they were aware of that or not. In any case, you did mention Thomas Hobbes, who would be the real originator of the contract theory before Locke. But Locke was the one to whom Americans looked, and Locke presented the idea of contract theory in a much more attractive light, since the government that was drawn from it could be a more Republican form of government, whereas in Locke's view, this civil government becomes government of a leviathan, of a powerful person. So it was a little bit more commodious and acceptable to people. That was the doctrine that was circulating in America in the 18th century.
Yeah,
Yes?
But it did come out earlier. Aristotle said in politics that appeasement of the masses was important. Madison rejected that completely and thought domination and protection of the opulent minority was more the course that the American Constitution should take.
Where do you get that from? I don't know what I'm saying. I mean, if they thought wealth was and property were, no, that Madison was in favor simply of the dominant of the wealthy. I mean, they thought that the protection of property was really important. There's no doubt about that.
The property would be handled by a small few people, the opulent minority, and that they should be protected. And that was the purpose of the Constitution.
Well, I mean, property does tend to fall in the hands of some. Whether that's the purpose of the Constitution, I'm not sure. These people had fought, let's say, a decade earlier. Not Madison himself was not a soldier in the Revolutionary War, but many of the people at the convention had fought, and they had risked everything, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor in the Revolutionary War, in a cause that looked improbable of ever succeeding. So if they had really been concerned about maintaining their property, if that had been their greatest goal, they probably would never have revolted. Yet they took this risk. So why did they do it? Some people say, well, they were saints. Maybe Washington was. I don't know. It's possible or not. The other is that they saw in this a new opportunity, and also saw, after the Revolutionary War was over, that having done this with the Revolutionary War, that to complete the task, to make government stable, they had to take another task to assure their own prominence and their own glory. So many of the founders that got together in 1787, they said, we need to have a new constitution to sustain liberal democratic government. If not, this first experiment in liberal democratic government will fail, and probably with it, the future of liberal democratic government itself, down the tubes. So this was a moment that they saw everything on the line, and also their own reputation on the line. If the Constitution had failed, who would the founders, those people we call the founders, be today? There would be nothing, maybe a small footnote in a long text in a different political system altogether, that Madison, Jefferson, and Hamilton, and a few others got together and tried to change things, but it never really worked out. that would have been it. So they had a variety of motives, but whether the idea was to maintain just the wealth of a select few, I think would be an exaggeration of what they did. In addition to which, at the Times, those who opposed the Constitution, the anti-federalists, the other option, most of them were wealthy too. So the debate was taking place, admittedly, between the more elite sections of society at that time. There's no doubt about that. But the question was, which was the best direction to go, rather than merely to protect one's property or the property of others who could succeed in the system as wealth was generated in different ways.
In light of the previous question, how do you view the prospects of the Constitution of the United States? Do you believe it is susceptible to being undermined through sociological and educational or miseducational methods over long periods of time?
Well, I suppose so. There's a lot of people who might not be favorable to the Constitution or understand it. Let's start with understanding. That's a matter of education. I'm in higher education, so pay more attention to that than secondary and primary education. But the decline in the teaching of anything about the founding, I don't mean celebrating the founding, I mean encountering it seriously in most colleges and universities has been forgotten. So where do students get their knowledge of this event? I take my own university, a few courses accepted. There isn't much attention at all paid to this, not in political science, which is fine discipline, but it has other concerns today than teaching anything about America's historical founding. Not in history courses, by and large, which are dealing with other subjects. So where does it appear? And this is supposed to be a university that has the aura of the founders about it. It doesn't. And as you go from university to university, you find that this is, to a large extent, the case. Our political science today is not a political science which has much room for this kind of analysis. So that would be the educational side. On the other side, do people truly believe in the Constitution? Well, it is true in the Constitution that sometimes people don't believe in it very much, but when they find it advantageous to their position, they back it. And that's maybe enough, because as political parties change, people who were not much concerned about it suddenly profess concern, whether they believe it or not, and the others oppose certain things about the Constitution, and the Constitution can in ways survive somewhat without those fully committed or understanding of it. But I would say in the long run, there still has to be a group of people who are devoted honestly to trying to preserve the Constitution as such, not just for expediential reasons. There has to be some group that really understands what the mechanism is and why it's important to maintain it despite your partisan leanings. And you can look around and ask whether that's still the case today. I'm not so sure it fully is.
There have been some Supreme Court judges in the 20th century that have divorced the Declaration of Independence from the Constitution. Constitution's law, Declaration of Independence is kind of historical stuff that really doesn't have any legal effect. What would Madison's view have been of that? And how connected would he have thought that the Declaration of Independence was with the Constitution?
So I would say that the Declaration is referred to indirectly in the Constitution itself, when it refers back at the end to the certain years when the Constitution was written. And in the Federalist Papers, they speak of the Declaration and the theory upon which it was based. So it was like something that existed in the background to the Constitution. In many of the state constitutions, they included something like a declaration, a statement of rights. Let's take the first two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. They put that right inside the Constitution. So the founders of America's Constitution decided not to do that because we already had the Declaration. So the purpose of government, as they say continually in this, is one of the great purposes is to protect rights and provide for people's safety. So it does rely on the the Declaration. Maybe it's not put there in perfect language, but it pretty much relies on the Declaration. Now, historically, there have been people who have tried to separate the Declaration from the Constitution. Normally today, I said at the beginning that we treat the founding period as a whole, meaning something that the various parts fit together. There was a revolution. Okay, it didn't work out completely afterwards with the Articles, which tried to implement the Declaration. So we went to the Constitution. They're largely consistent. End of argument. Well, of course, before the Civil War, you had the Southerners who, for a long time, accepted the Constitution. After all, it had certain provisions that they liked, certain compromises that the founders had to engage in. They accepted the Constitution, but they said that the Declaration, at a certain point, was a great lie. So they separated the Constitution and the Declaration, honoring the Constitution. And the progressives later on, when they called for rewriting the Constitution, they said the Declaration was great. Unlike the gentleman there, they said the Declaration was a democratic document. Everything democratic was bound up with it. But the Constitution was something that merely protected the property of the few. And therefore, the two weren't compatible. Those have been two important periods in American history where those two documents have been separated. But today, they're largely put together, maybe without any knowledge. People just sort of say, hey, they were all founders, what the heck? But they are kind of put together, and as I mentioned, you could celebrate them all on July 4th without feeling terribly embarrassed. Yes, ma'am.
I do think it's, in terms of the Declaration and the Constitution and Madison's thought about it, I find it fascinating that some of the early members of the Revolution, Patrick Henry, did not support ratification. Hancock basically had to be bribed. New York had to be threatened to ratify. So a lot of sort of founding members there in the second the convention declaring independence. And Jefferson and Adams wrote papers about letters back and forth about the Constitution, saying, it's too monarchical or it's too oligarchic. So there were a lot of important people who were involved in the Declaration who did not like the Constitution, did not sign it, did not support ratifications. So I think there is a slight separation because we have people who weren't there, who refused to stand behind it.
Yeah, that's true. There was a debate on the Constitution whether Jefferson ended up supporting, like everything else he did, he ended up supporting the Constitution with some ifs, as usual, probably because he wasn't there to write it. And to be a little bit nasty about Jefferson, who I love very much, he's the founder of the University of Virginia, the architect of our great university. But if according to his theory, the Constitution would be rewritten every 18 years, then it couldn't be an object of veneration. But one document inadvertently remains an object of veneration. And that object is the Declaration of Independence, which means all the current founders are out, and one person remains the individual who wrote the key document, and that would be Jefferson. And fine. I also add, I went on a rant here, Steve, but I like Jefferson very much. It also is the case that he was very bold to claim that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence. He drafted it in a committee, but the committee was in charge, and the committee made a lot of changes, and he made the claim that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, which I think is a little bit presumptuous. He could have said as head of the committee, I played a key role, could have all sorts of sentences like that. But he quickly found that identifying self with the author of the Declaration was a very good deal for himself. So he promoted that deliberately because we know he put on his gravestone, and he wrote the text of the gravestone, that Thomas Jefferson was founder of the University of Virginia, religious bill for freedom, and author of the Declaration of Independence. Not quite. Yeah.
Sir, I would like to ask your opinion. Some 30 states have asked for a constitutional convention, and I'm wondering what you think. If Madison's prejudices, which have endured today, would endure after a constitutional convention.
Yeah, I think that they would help to prevent this constitutional convention from taking place. it might happen, and people who are frustrated do it, but when you look at the reasons that people want to do it, they want to do it for opposite reasons. And so it doesn't seem to me that there is a real consensus in favor of redoing the Constitution. I don't know. I do see at the convention people like Hamilton and Madison and Gouverneur Morris, and I think today that we would have Nancy Pelosi and Paul Ryan and people like that who might not be of the same ilk. This is nothing against the modern age, by the way. When you think of America and why there's some basis for reverence for the founders, you have to think of it in these terms. In the period between, say, 1765 or 1770 and 1793, the best minds in America were concerned about politics, about how to found the government. That was what they devoted their thinking to. They were all active. Many of them were active in formulating constitutions at the state level, writing them and rewriting them, asking what was good and bad about them. And then many of them were involved in debating the Constitution itself. In short, the brain power of America was devoted to that objective of the Constitution. Once the Constitution was accepted, where is our brain power gone? Probably many of the best students at Texas Tech are not concerned about getting up tomorrow and rewriting a Constitution. They don't think about it in those terms. They're probably in science or something like that. So our brain power isn't devoted to this. That was one thing one could say in favor, maybe, of Jefferson's plan. Jefferson had this plan, as I mentioned, to rewrite the Constitution. And part of the reason was, he said, if you don't rewrite the Constitution, each generation hasn't gone through the process of asking, why do we have the institutions we have? And thinking it through, or at least hearing it thought through by others, how a government is set up and why. Instead, most of us pretty much say, well, it's the government. I can't change it. I've never thought about it. It's just there. And so for that reason, he thought that reverence for the Constitution would weaken people's thought. They would take it on the basis of the fact that it existed rather than the fact that they made it. And that's why Madison in these Federalist Papers has to show that there might be something to that idea, but the risks of doing this are so great and the chances of failure are so enormous that we're better off to accept some of the problems with revering our Constitution than with this, I would say, utopian idea of rewriting the Constitution every 18 years. It has something to say for itself in the realm of abstract theory, but not in practice. Yeah.
So one of the key ideas of the Constitution that has survived various amendments is the idea that the officers of the United States government swear an oath to protect the Constitution, which is found in military oaths and the oath of office of all offices. So that is very much encouraging reverence of the Constitution. The military swears an oath not to protect the American people per se, but rather to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So every other nation will tend to have an oath sworn to the head of state or their monarch, whereas we swear an oath to the Constitution. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on the origination of that idea. Was that a strictly Madisonian ideal, or was there other debate on the was there debate on the oath clause, as it were?
I can't remember if there was exact debate. It was certainly not strictly Madison's, and I don't know if it was debated at length. But it was certainly put, because we have a lot of what went on at the convention. I mean, Madison was, in one respect, amazing in the sense that after leading a lot of the debate at Philadelphia, then he went back every night and reproduced these notes that he had taken. And still, we only have probably about 25% of what was actually said. So I don't know exactly how that was debated at the convention. I don't think it was an important idea. I think it was accepted. Recall that for the president, it's an oath or an affirmation. That was to a compromise with the Quakers who didn't, but it's very important. And that oath was very important to Lincoln as well. In the Civil War, he says, I took an oath to the Constitution to defend it and protect it as I see fit. And that was one of the sources that he relied on for the extraordinary use of executive authority at the time. And I know other people in the United States also take an oath, but the presidential oath is in the Constitution. That the text of the oath is in there for the president alone, not just an oath. Other? Yes, sir.
So, just to clarify, would you say that the founding would be closer to more of a Machiavellian political theory or thought, which seems to emphasize this single person or single group take control of the situation?
One of the differences they make, Madison does say, is that it wasn't the work of a single mind.
Okay.
So I don't think when he refers to the fact that it was done by a group, that he meant everyone at the convention. There were some guys at the convention who hung out and didn't say much or do much. I think he had maybe 3 or 4, the movers and shakers at the convention, 5 or 6 major figures. Those were the ones who probably had in mind as the important founders. And he, of course, was one of that group. And so that's one difference with the past. I'm not exactly sure that Madison thought, even though he mentioned that as something that made us superior to the past, I'm not exactly sure that he believed that that was definitive, that argument. The other argument, in a way, the founders make pretty clear throughout, is that they were writing a constitution in a way that had to be accepted by the people. They didn't have a military force. I'm not sure they would have ever used it. And people ask about the elimination of slavery. You couldn't have eliminated slavery and had acceptance of the Constitution, as they well realized. It was inevitable. Keep the South, you're keeping slaves for the time being. So, so they didn't have an army at their disposition. And I think that was an important point. And Madison said, but the Constitution did have the fact that it could be accepted by the American people. And that was a kind of practical measure of a pretty good system which they thought they were forming.
Okay.
Is this the last one? Good.
All right.
Are you the last one?
All right, so given your history, knowing your history on the Constitution and everything, there is a movement today to have a constitution of the states, like to rewrite the Constitution or add amendments to the Constitution, things like that. Your opinion on that kind of behavior?
Well, I mean, it would depend what amendments we have. I'm not just for amending. I'm not opposed to amending, but I'm not just for amending to say that we can amend.
Well, Mallory, what are they wanting to do to the Constitution?
Well, some people want to amend, say, the Electoral College. That's one thing. Other people want to amend the Constitution to eliminate the Second Amendment. They talk about that.
No, I mean, they're wanting to rewrite the Constitution. They want to take a vote on rewriting the Constitution.
Oh, rewrite the whole Constitution.
And then,
yeah, I guess that might be behind it. Once you would have a convention called, presumably.
Article 5.
Oh, yeah.
Article 5.
Yeah, that's the amending clause, which is done in 2 different ways, but one of them would involve a convention. And the convention, presumably, once it met, could go in any different direction and maybe try and rewrite the Constitution using the example. This is why what happens at the beginning is so important. And using the example of the founding, the founders went way beyond their license in proposing a new constitution. They were only supposed to amend the Articles of the Confederation. What did they do? They met at the convention and they rewrote the whole thing. Madison was, in the Federalists, makes a great effort to try and convince people that the chain of legality was never broken. Because once you admit the chain of legality is broken, then why won't someone else do it? But at the end of that Federalist paper, he says, well, if it were broken, it was done for the national good and had to be done. So in a way, he has it both ways. I suppose such a convention could try to rewrite the Constitution. And we'd have to see what would happen and whether it would be accepted, and I'm not looking for that right now. Okay?
One more question.
Oh, one more question, yeah.
I had my only required government class in 1961, and the whole class was trashing the Constitution. There was nothing positive, nothing good about the Constitution. So it started a long time ago in the university setting, and that's at Texas Tech. the conservative center of the nation almost. But I kind of got the idea that the founders, because they included some farmers, people who were dirt poor, they may have had a little higher view of protection of the freedoms that they had abused and had seen abused, and of course was the reason for the revolution, but go back and protect it because they feared this government without having a procedure that because people were imperfect and they recognized it.
Yeah, that's for sure.
They tried to include in it, and I felt like that they did know history very well and knew what worked and what didn't. I don't know if that's a correct observation.
I would say, I mean, they knew history, but of course, that was contemporary. The history we're talking about was contemporary to them.
Well, right, but there was a history. You've cited some of the early examples that preceded them, looking at civilization way back. So.
I mean, I suppose a mixed crowd in America at the time. There were some who were well-schooled, had good liberal arts educations, had studied these things, others who didn't know that much about the history of constitutions. I mean, Madison himself, when the idea of rewriting the Constitution emerged, he was a pretty smart guy. He learned some stuff at Princeton, but he went and he studied, for 2 years, the history of constitutions in the world, getting every book he could. It wasn't easy. He didn't have Amazon. He couldn't have them all sent. Studying them and taking notes upon all the Constitution. It was a remarkable act of comparative government that he undertook, which I think few others were aware of, completely. They knew about the British Constitution, obviously, and something about other constitutions, but not to the extent that Madison had studied, going back to antiquity and looking at all the constitutions he could. So, it was a mixed thing. We can't assume that everyone then was completely knowledgeable and everyone today is completely ignorant, though that's not a bad starting point.
They did have more knowledge than the average. That they were delegates. Even the dirt farmers had some knowledge and some common sense, or they wouldn't have been leaders and been sent there.
I would suspect so. Well, thank you very much.